So without further ado, I'm going to turn my camera off, hand over to Carl and Clayton to introduce themselves and take it from here. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Trace.
Great, thank you so much. So Clayton, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself first?
Man, I gotta follow Pelotons. I don't know. So Clayton Chandler, the CISO for the investment bank in the Americas and risk and compliance and other things at Credit Suisse. I'm on the East Coast, not the West Coast, so I'm joining you guys from New York. So you'll probably hear, I don't know, sirens or something outside my window. It's a lot colder, and yes, I'm looking forward to stuffing my face. So just quick, my background. So I kind of grew up in the government. So I was at the National Security Agency for a long time. Joined Credit Suisse about 6 years ago, initially actually as a quant. So my PhD is in data analytics, not information security. Kind of meandered my way over into cyber at some point over the past 5 years, and then have been the global head of cybersecurity, and then most recently named the CISO over the past few years. So nice to meet you guys.
Great, thank you, Clayton. Team, my name is Carl Wright. Well, I serve as the Chief Commercial Officer here at AttackIQ. I too come out of the Department of Defense. My last job there was Chief Security Officer for the Marine Corps and worked on a lot of things like cyber-centric maneuver warfare, dynamic deception operations, and active computer network defense before coming over to the dark side here on the sales side. We've got a great topic for you today. One I'm obviously very keen in, and Clayton, 2020 has been kind of a interesting year from many aspects, and we've seen kind of a continued year-over-year escalation in the number of cyber attacks that not just the financial sector and banks have been dealing with, but quite frankly, consumers, individuals, people at home on a daily basis. And then we throw this pandemic on top of it. So I imagine the CISO job got a little bit tougher in 2020.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, just right off the bat, like housekeeping note, I think I can speak for Carl too. We're very flexible, open people. So if you guys have questions, please use the QA function, but this is going to be pretty informal. So 2020 has lasted about 5 years. And, if I draw an analogy to kind of risk management, I think of risk management having three vectors. You've got obviously impact and likelihood, and that impact and likelihood happens on some type of attack surface, right? But the thing with 2020, it's like you're playing a sport, and whether it's football or baseball, but like while you're playing the sport, the guy with like the white paint thing is like on the field, reshaping the field while you're playing the sport, right? So that whole like attack surface thing has been a very dynamic variable when we've been trying to kind of lay out like risk management plans, whether that's an aggressive shift to working from home. And, at the beginning of March, our statistics footprint, allowed for, let's say, 25% of our staff to work from home. And then literally by the end of March, it had to be 100. The way that cascaded through the organization, bringing on new collaboration tools like the one we're on right now, and really going deep at assessing the risk of those introduced to an organization, both with information security and compliance. Emerging threats. For example, we now have an increased dependency on our internet service providers and the threat of distributed denial of service attacks, which there's been no shortage of those over the past several months. And so it's been a very dynamic year, and not by choice. I think we've all struggled with how we've accounted for long-term strategic thinking this year. I think it's put us initially in a bit of a reactive position, but I also think it's been a great opportunity. I can point to, I was on a conversation last week with one of our CIOs for our investment bank, and COVID did more for our cloud journey than we would have accomplished in the next 2 years if we didn't have that forcing function at the table, right? So, when I think about the role of the CISO, just as it's a challenge to our CIO teams and application teams and our businesses to understand how to take advantage of this, to deliver that emerging technology or business strategy that they have. Like, we've got to be good and we've got to be talented because we have to match that, and we have to make sure that we lead them there with the right level of expertise, and that we're not on our heels, right? Because I think one of the risks you're running, and one of the ways you're potentially exposed through COVID, is if you're not able to cope with the rate of necessary change. And through that, the CISO is seen less as a partner and a co-designer, but more as a gate that we've got to get through. to get to production, right?
Well,
like you don't want to be that gate.
I've got to double click on something. You're on a roll. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm going to. So
go ahead, man.
So if 2020 was stormy, you're saying 2021 is cloudy.
Oh boy, no, I don't know.
You're gonna see a lot more cloud.
I'm not gonna.
I'm only talking about your migration to the cloud, right? I'm talking about the rapid adoption of cloud services and technology, and you said the word dynamic several times. When I think about cloud and the CIO, I think about fluid and elastic. Those aren't exactly words.
Yeah, right? I mean, the way that I think about it is, if we talk about, let's say, the Earth orbiting the sun, and maybe without COVID as that forcing function, the sun, the center of gravity, is maybe your risk management process. And the Earth that's orbiting it, is people trying to get stuff done, right? Like, hey, I'm really trying to move the ball forward. Like, I'm really trying to deliver this new tech. And I'm going to impact the way I deliver that tech so that I don't impact our process. And I think what COVID at least has done for us is it's the exact opposite. The mission is to get this transformation delivered. And if you need to enhance, augment, change the way that you handle risk management without sacrificing the depth that you go into, then change it, because we've got to get this done. We have no choice, right? And so I think that's some of the good that we've seen out of COVID. But yeah, man, it's been wild and woolly.
Well, it's interesting when we take a look at IT in the early 2000s and kind of this rush to distributed client server applications and architectures, decentralized computing frameworks seem to be coming back to centralized computing frameworks again, right? But during the 2000s, the CIOs had a lot of money to kind of do whatever they wanted to do. And then someone said, hey, what's our return on investment? So it seemed like, they went through some budget challenges in the late 2000s, and that pressure probably created some diamonds, that stress, right?
Yep.
Do you see any diamonds being made right now for you guys from in your strategy?
I think so. Again, I go back to the collaboration in cloud space, where there is going to be a net financial benefit to the company by getting on the other side of these transformations. And I think what we've, the biggest impact of the pandemic has been cutting through a lot of the analysis paralysis that was happening of, should we do it? Should we not? Is it really cost beneficial when you really add up all the time and the cost of change? And well, now it's like, no, like, dude, you got to, like, you got to do it, So in that sense, I think it's helped us help ourselves. Even if, look, I mean, a lot of the immediate steps that have been taken to enable people to work during the pandemic have introduced an element of risk, right? It has. We are so much more dependent on our ISPs now, and we're so much more dependent on, users' local endpoints now, right? And then the level of dirtiness that might be in those environments. And it's our job to just consciously manage that risk, right? And I think that we've been able to do that, not completely clean, right? Because of the inherent risk landscape, right? There's threats. You will get hit by a DDoS attack. It is going to happen, right? But I'm really kind of proud of the way we've embraced the change, and right. and that's been cool to see happen.
Well, so we got a great question here from Megan. So, as a bank, you guys, have a pretty healthy security budget. You're making investments on a yearly basis. You're thinking about those investments in the out years.
Should be bigger though, but yeah.
So as you look to the past, has there ever been a situation where the security organization felt very strongly about an investment, but it was costly and the the financial side said no, or decided that wasn't going to make it above the line, I guess?
I mean, sure, that's happened. I mean, I think the biggest onus on us, and I suspect we'll talk about threat informed defense later in this conversation, is changing that from an investment conversation to a financially quantified risk conversation, right? And I'll plug you guys for a minute. How do things like Attack and AttackIQ help you with that, right? Where the thing that I'm asking for isn't a new piece of technology. I'm not saying, hey, I need to buy 80,000 licenses for the latest and greatest endpoint detection and response solution because I went to their booth at RSA and it was cool, right? You're saying that I need to buy 80,000 licenses for that technology because it will demonstrably reduce the residual risk associated with this threat vector. And by doing, and by doing so, again, one thing kind of unique to a bank, if you guys are at all familiar with things like Basel II with BCBS or what we have to do in the US in terms of holding capital on account of operational risk. And so the way that we've operationalized quantitative cyber risk modeling is, we go to the table with a look, hey, I'm not asking you to buy a tool. I'm asking you, do you want to invest this to, demonstrably reduce this operational risk, which then the next stage of that story for us is, and by the way, we could then lower that capital buffer to reinvest back into the company, right? So the big thing that's kind of unlocked for us is that linkage between improving your technical security controls, the level of residual risk, and then the very real sort of financial models that come off the back of that risk, right? But that's still not to say they haven't said no. Like sometimes the answer may be no. And that's where, now I kind of pivot more to the GRC side of being a CISO and not the deep techie side of being a CISO and say, well, those that run the business are authorized to say that, but are they consciously doing that knowing the risk footprint? And if the answer is yes, then
I'm smiling. I'm smiling, buddy, because you're well, and I think we'll touch on this later, but you're talking about the convergence of risk management and threat management, right? In many aspects. I have another CISO friend in the healthcare space, and the other thing you're talking about is how to sell your program and making sure you talk in the language of the business, right? And for him, as a healthcare service provider, everything he talks about is, from a threat perspective, what's the population? We do security because of patient safety, not for cybersecurity. Right. It's a patient safety issue, right? It reminds me of a conference I was at in the UK several years ago, and one of the questions was, how many people in the room have all the budget they need? There was a bunch of CISOs in the room, and not very many people raised their hand. And the individual speaking said, well, you suck at selling. You should take, you should learn how to sell your program better internally. So what's your comment to that?
No, look, I mean, storytelling is a key element of being in this job, I think, right? But this happens all the time. I mean, I think of like CISO gone bad is the CISO that gets a call from his head of infrastructure that says, why the hell do you have 13 agents on my endpoints and you're sucking away all my CPU and memory? Like, what are you guys doing, right? Like the successful CISO, and I don't know if I'm one or not, right? But they say, look, let me articulate to you on your terms the reason why these things exist, and it's not a conversation around technology or tooling or, I think back to these kind of nonsensical conversations around like performance versus security. Like that's not what we're talking about, right? It's like there's threats and there's threat management, and based off the threat landscape, you make decisions about your risk, and there's risk management. And the answer is not a completely risk-free environment, right? So therefore, the answer is not the CISO needs all the budget in the world, but the answer is a very consciously managed, accepted risk footprint that's in line with an established risk appetite that you set, right? And you can fall above that line or below that line, but you shouldn't be talking about. It depends on who you're talking to. Like if you go, talk with the guys on the ground about like flops and IOPS, like that's cool. Like go do that. But your business conversation shouldn't be around technology.
Well, I think that's a great lead-in. So I hope everybody on the call is familiar with Mitre Attack. We're not going to do a Mitre Attack primer here, but what does the adoption of the framework like Mitre Attack? Where does that come in for you in the bank? Yeah,
great question. I mean, to me, I'll go back to that comment about storytelling. It's a Rosetta Stone, right? And what I mean is if there are 4 stakeholder groups that kind of matter in that conversation, you've got the information security organization kind of playing the central coordination role. You've got, your business leadership. You've got the people that are delivering key controls for you on the ground. So think the people that deliver your identity function, your cyber, your SOC, your vulnerability management solution. And then you've got the kind of business embedded application teams or IT folks that need to adopt those solutions to reduce risk. And what we've been able to kind of do with AttackIQ, or just with Mitre Attack in general, really over the past couple of years, And look, we're still very much on the journey. Like we haven't like high scored this, right? But you know, if you take the end-to-end process for threat management, where you say, look, there are threats in the world, and I've got some intelligence function that exists to take those threats and produce some kind of, you know, relatively up-to-date data structure about the threat landscape. And there's that. And then I've got, okay, like that's cool. And then I've got those threats that manifest as it exists as a set of techniques and procedures that bad guys use. Like there's threats have actors and techniques. So then, okay, now I've got my list of techniques that exist. And I want to marry my techniques up with my controls. So now I've got my information security team talking to my cyber threat intelligence team, now coming back and talking with my identity and access management, network security, data protection, you know, all of my different core control groups, and then coming back and talking with the business about, look, from an end-to-end process, from the threat being materialized as actors and techniques, controls being to some extent applied to those techniques to control the level of risk in the environment. You know, I can then, if you're thinking about like a bipartite graph between like threat groups or threats and then like my business lines, I'm able to have a very real data-driven empirical conversation about our business's ability to control a threat by an actual group, right? And it's not an exact science, like the industry hasn't completely cracked the nut yet, but I think the promise of the adoption of Attack is exactly that, right? And it helps that investment discussion that we talked about, and just in general helps link, you know, that conversation from the business of like, why, you know, why do I care? It's like, well, here's exactly why you should care. And if you're, you know, if you're not necessarily the business, but you're delivering technology for the business, and you say, look, we are rolling out our next generation access management solution. And, you know, as compared to the previous generation, it's got coverage for these types of techniques that are used by these types of actors to compromise identity. And all you need to do is onboard your application from the old thing to the new thing. But through Attack, they can see it, right? Like, oh shit, I actually do care. Like, no, I don't want bad guys hacking me, right? So, you know, I think every company like had their own version of it to some degree, at least kind of big companies. But because it's now a kind of de facto open standard, and because there's a team behind it, like a community behind it, keeping it up to date, it's really helped kind of enable those conversations.
Well, I obviously, we're big fans of it. And, you know, when was it, 3 years ago, almost maybe 4 years ago, Verizon, you know, their annual DBIR report comes out where they kind of catalog all the breaches from the previous year. And in one of those reports, they had commented that 82% of the breaches that they had analyzed, someone had bought a security control, but it was improperly configured. And so, you know, we're talking about optimization, and I think optimization kind of has at least a minimum of two flavors. One, you know, you bought all this stuff. Is it optimally configured to block or detect or meet and exceed what your expectations were? But the other one is like around your strategy of where you have gaps and where you want to make future investments. How do you look at the as-is environment?
No, I think you're totally right. I mean, it's definitely shifted the way that we've looked at our like heat map of security investment, right? So if you look at it through the lens of Attack, you know, and now we have this kind of mental image of an actor needing to kind of chronologically go, I guess I'll go this way. No, wait, this way, from left to right. Where were we overinvested, right? So, you know, I think a lot of companies probably the same reaction we did. When you look at your controls, you sort of overlay them defense in depth across the matrix, and you're like, holy shit, I've got all this investment here that are all controlling the same types of threat, but I've got nothing over here, right? And it doesn't mean that's a new technology. It could be a new process. It could be new training. It could be, but allocating your investment, and maybe investment's the wrong term because it's not just a financial thing, but allocating your attention to certain areas of information security, I think it changed our thinking a bit of where we maybe were focusing too much versus not focusing enough, right? In terms of where we should be spending that just like mind share in terms of what could happen, you know?
Well, we got some great questions that you know, this kind of leads directly into, and so I'll just paraphrase them because there's some overlap. based on this discussion, kind of what's the percentage of spend for security versus, overall IT? What's healthy? And
that's a good question. Yeah, because we try to, there's no easy answer to that, at least at CS, because there's two ways to think about security investment. There's, the introduction of controls based on the way you do it today. Like, so if you think about a power law, right? And then, you've got like tail of things like end of life and the tail of things like vulnerabilities that have been in the environment for years and years and years. And we kind of know what those things are. Then in some sense, your IT transformation investment is your security investment, because the idea is you don't invest in securing the tail, you invest in making the tail go away, right? So if we could take an application, that's running on our existing on-premise estate, and the communication for that application uses insecure protocols as an example, and it's going to be a 2-year investment to make sure that they don't use those insecure protocols so that they come off the other side of a vulnerability report being clean. Like, they could do that, or you could just re-platform the application to be cloud native and go that way. So, like, I'm not trying to kind of skirt around the question, because we do take, and we have a regulatory obligation to do this with our Swiss regulator, to put a security lens on our year-on-year IT investment strategy. But it's not so much of like, hey, you're doing a thing, how do you secure it? Because the answer could just be a radical transformation instead of securing something that already exists.
Well, you run a big organization, so it's a complex question and answer. But for our listeners, I'm gonna double click on you and press on it. Is, rule of thumb, 10%, 15%, which, how would you?
No, it's more than that.
It's
more than that. It's not 50%, but it's not 10%. It's probably 20. Rule of thumb. And again, it's very much case by case, because what does it mean to execute the security aspect of a project could be different, right? Well, and but as a general rule of thumb, 20.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, also, executing your IT in different environments has different costs. Is it cheaper to execute security in cloud?
Oh, wow, that's a loaded question.
It totally is.
It's extremely different. It's not cheaper yet, because we still need to invest in the change in addition to the run. So in theory, not in theory, I think it's a well-modeled problem. In time, it's potentially cheaper, as the solution to many of your security concerns is rebuild through CI/CD versus patch, for example. But you've got to establish the factory and the pipeline to enable that, and that's not cheap.
Well, it's also new, right? It's brand new.
Yeah. So if I think about like the outlay, like there's a lot of kind of spend to save, right? If I can nail my delivery pipeline, and I really am running on relatively ephemeral infrastructure that I rebuild every night, and we've kept a pretty high bar for cloud adoption. Like, we're not doing MAS, infrastructure as a service VM migrations into the cloud. You've really got to re-platform to be cloud native. So if we hold the line on that and we properly invest in the pipeline, in time, I think it's a cost positive play, but it's not yet, because we're still building the plumbing.
Got it. All right. So, Mitre Attack is obviously a common lexicon for cyber defenders to talk about threat. People are using it in a lot of different ways. But, while the periodic table of adversary behavior is a really simplistic way you can explain to your mom what's going on, the actually operationalization of it can be challenging. Where would you say the biggest challenges of operationalizing Mitre Attack have been for you?
The number of diverse groups that are involved in making it successful. I talked a little bit about that earlier, between your cyber IT team, your broader IT team, the business. A lot of these things, and I can go back years and years and years, and even outside of the cyberspace. Anytime you're introducing something that's intended to be a standard or a way of talking, and your broader organization isn't bought into doing it that way, it just becomes another one of the things that exist and just exacerbates the problem that exists, right? So the challenge for us was getting the broader ecosystem to agree that it would be that periodic table. And that's, the CISO group, your second line defense, operational risk management group, your broader risk organization, your business IT, your central IT, forcing people, you know, if you hear of a risk conversation happening about cyber, but you're forcing people to kind of point with their finger, where are you talking about? Like, that was the challenge, right? It still is the challenge, right? There's still a lot of education happening. Not education on attack, like people know it exists, people know it's there, but the operationalization of it. And, you know, not just education internally, but like with our regulators and our stakeholders. And I spend way too much of my time talking with regulators, who I hope none of the 53 people on the call are regulators. But it's you know, the challenge is in the adoption, because it's a relatively straightforward model. It's not hard to understand, right? But you've got to all speak that same language, or like I said, it just becomes another attempt at establishing a standard that becomes another reason why we need a standard, right? Because it's the 101st way of describing something.
Well, look, there's something I'm obviously super excited about, which is kind of this new up and coming operational concept from Mitre called threat informed defense, right? And so Mitre, you know, defines this as the systematic application of deep understanding of adversary tradecraft and technology to prevent, detect, and or respond to cyber attacks. And so, you know, what are your thoughts on this, and how are you looking at it from a people, process, and maybe an organizational perspective? I think this kind of this is a trailing question to the cross-functional aspect of Mitre Attack that we just talked about, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's where I think so many organizations are still working through it, right? You know, I mean, I'm very kind of really happy and proud to say that just recently, actually, we produced our Q3 kind of residual risk report on information security for, I mentioned FINMA earlier, who's our constituent regulator in Switzerland, and the machinery underpinning that report, from, you know, metrics off the back of controls within our first line of defense, to adversarial models seeded by threat intelligence, to, you know, risk analysis done by like all the people in the risk group at a bank that do risk analysis that I'm not going to pretend that I understand. Attack was in the middle of that, right? So that's like really cool. That's like an actual real GCP bank telling a real regulator about their real cyber risk footprint that Attack helped drive, right? So like that, you know, we're still very much like, there's still probably way too much manual work in that pipeline, you know? And I don't want people to leave this call thinking that like I'm shilling for AttackIQ as this magic bullet that totally automates that, because like we as an industry just aren't there yet, right? But I do believe in the promise, and it's been cool to see more of it kind of real, you know?
No, absolutely. So we've got a great question from Jake here, and what he's wondering is, what are some public sources that perhaps you guys use at the bank, or you know of, for threat trends? Where do you guys monitor anything open source other than
yeah, quite a few things. I mean, you know, we're fortunate to have a lot of investment in our own proprietary stuff that we do pay for, but public, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I'll take the name and hit the person up offline and give some examples, but you know, some signals are cleaner than other signals, right? Yeah, I'm not going to name names because I don't want to talk about some of our threat sharing groups, but I think a big key is, I think one of the challenges in the sort of like front door intelligence world is you've got to have a model, right? And I think back to kind of 5 years ago when tips became really popular, and, you know, we're going to buy a tip and we're going to pump it full of intelligence and it's going to solve this problem for us. But like, it kind of failed, and it sort of failed because you as an organization have to have your model for what you're expecting as input, or else it's just like this garbage in, garbage out problem. So I don't know if I would like really like stand on the heel and like say, these guys are awesome, go check out this public intelligence source, because you've got to have a way of consuming the information that makes sense to the stuff you're going to use the information for, or else it's just a whole bunch of stuff. And some of the stuff is better than some of the other stuff, but it's just stuff, you know?
Well, and you've got to be able to parse it based on what your attack surface is, and your surface in the cloud will be different than your surface on on-prem. So there's a process to it, right? You know, one of the things I want to do, I'm going to share my screen here real quick, maybe, if it allows me to. And let's see if it does. Allow rings, let's see, yep. I got a open a system preference, team. Sorry about that. I'm using Ring Central for the first time, and so of course, I've got to do this. So hopefully, let's see if this works now. And there we go. All right. So, speaking of places to get good information, I'm not sure if the audience is aware of Mitre Center for Threat Informed Defense. The CTID is where Mitre Attack actually lives now, and you guys can check it out on the website. It's important because this is an industry consortium where we focus on the betterment of attack and threat-informed defense. You can see the participants of the center there. We publish research projects for the public good on a monthly basis. And in fact, today, we just published a bunch of new cloud TTPs for AWS, and we have a lot more cloud projects coming out of the center. This one we worked on with JPMC. But there's lots of great research that you guys can take advantage of, whether it's around cloud, whether it's around adversary emulation, like Pin 6 we just released, or next week we're actually releasing a mapping between 853 and the Mitre Attack framework. And Clayton and I spent some time on the call today actually talking about how to take Mitre Attack and translate it for the risk organization. And so that mapping will be critical for organizations to practice threat-informed defense, which kind of represents this convergence between risk management and threat management. And the other thing we did with Mitre Attack is we published this last month. A lot of the content came directly from Mitre Attack team. We added a bunch of different use cases and case studies on how to operationalize Mitre Attack in this very easy to read book. My mom even liked it. And then the last
let me give a Carl. Can I give a shout out to the book real quick? So I was able to kind of read the book. It's a couple. It's not an AttackIQ sales job, so thank you, Carl. But it's also not a like AttackIQ as a model for dummies. It's really about like how do you operationalize it. I really liked it. Like I thought it was really well written. It's a pretty quick read. So I just want to give it a shout out and say it's if you're going to read something off the back of this meeting, it's worth your time.
No, I appreciate that, Clayton. And for the audience, I mean, AttackIQ does a lot of research for the public good. This book is part of that. You won't find hardly anything in the book at all on AttackIQ other than just a brief summary of us as a company. And that also goes for AttackIQ Academy, which is a free resource where we teach operationalization of Mitre Attack. We've got a ton of classes in there. We teach purple teaming. This is led by folks out of NSA that are on our team. And we teach breach and attack simulation. AttackIQ Academy is an industry academy. It is not a vendor academy. What that means is all these courses are about the subject matter, not about us as a company or our technology. And we just crossed 9,500 students in Academy globally that have taken courses and that continue to take courses. And next week we launch our brand new course, which is around uniting threat and risk management with NIST 853 and Mitre Attack. Also launching a new AttackIQ Academy, website, which you can kind of get a preview here. So I think that's kind of what we wanted to talk about with the team today with everyone, but kind of want to open it up for dialogue and see if there's any other interactive conversation you guys would like to have today.
Yeah, Carl, feel free to just kind of have a quick review. There's obviously quite a few questions that came in that we may have missed. One other question in a chat box here very quickly actually was just a question from Rommel asking, is that 20% viable for SMBs too, when you were mentioning that?
Have not exactly modeled that. I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, one of the things I'd comment on, for SMBs and mid-market, lower enterprise level corporations out there, the adoption of not just infrastructure as a service, but software as a service is pretty high. So our HR systems are all SaaS based. Our our document processing and email is all SaaS-based. The number of services that are SaaS-based now are for us is huge. And so I think that represents a completely different cost model for security there than maybe some of the things you have to.
I mean, like whenever we, again, I appreciate totally different kind of tier of organization, right? But whenever we modeled out the problem initially, SaaS is very, very cost positive. And I would say, the only thing with SaaS is, I'm not going to get into a big third-party risk management discussion, right? But the level of transparency needed to understand how those organizations meet your functional control objectives, just with no expectation that you're going to have a technical role implemented in them. But from a cost perspective, we went very heavy SaaS. And again, I think with PaaS, your theory is cost positive in the long run, but it was a pretty significant investment cost to get the pipeline stood up. And just for what it's worth for us, if you look at either the financial benefit of operating the infrastructure or the value gained by the transformation, like lifting and shifting IaaS for us was like not something we were interested in. We just didn't see a good, you can make an argument around things like data center costs, but even with that, we didn't see a very favorable position. So, very, very heavy SaaS, moving more PaaS, and then not just for what it's worth. CS is not terribly interested in IaaS.
So we have a question from Sylvia. Do you use the sliding scale of cybersecurity in your organization?
The sliding scale of cybersecurity.
And I have to be honest, I'm not sure what that is. So hopefully you can educate me.
Either. Yeah.
So
Sylvia, over to you to elaborate in the chat box, please. I know you're listening. Feel free to tackle something else, guys, while Sylvia just puts her thoughts down in writing.
Yeah. Let's see what else. Great comments in the chat session. I'm moving over here. Cybersecurity controls fail constantly and silently, either through misconfiguration or operational execution. What security optimization strategy would you recommend to have constant visibility?
This is where this is a scale thing, right? Like, because the answer is empirical data through red teaming, and it's only a matter of how much resource can you put on that. We see this constantly, and I know we've been talking about cloud, which is interesting because we see this especially in cloud. And I think this really started with us when we did our read across of the Capital One incident a couple of years ago, where this isn't a cloud problem; it's a configuration management problem. And how do you no questionnaire that anyone answers as part of a software development framework is going to capture things like misconfiguration of a WAF so that a bad actor uses a service account in a manual way, such as the case with Capital One, right? So, the answer for us, and again, very fortunate to be in the position where, CS has given us the resource to do so, but we've really transformed a lot of our risk management methodology from sample-based questioning to empirical red teaming, right? And, that's how we've captured several misconfigurations that would have been pretty bad if we didn't spot them.
Well, I do want to double click on that because, we do spend a lot of time talking about Mitre Attack, and it is a super important and useful framework. But, a lot of things that are out there that help you defend against the adversary aren't necessarily a security control. An S3 bucket configuration is not, per se, a security control. VPC configurations is not really managed by the security team. Active Directory is not usually managed by the security team, right? But all of these come together into a cohesive way to manage, kind of the stack, right? And so configuration management of those is probably equally as important as configuration management of the actual security controls.
Yep.
Well, I'm not quite sure how we're doing on time.
That's about perfect, actually. Like literally ended that sentence right as it came to time. So absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much, gentlemen. Very quickly, Sylvia has just said, yes, the 5 categories that break down cybersecurity, the SANS Institute actually has a format organizers can fill out: architecture, passive defense, active defense, intelligence, and offense. Do you guys use that approach within your organization, essentially, Clayton? Architecture, passive defense, active defense, intelligence, and offense.
I think that's really interesting because I think that with the exception of offense, and mention I used to work for the NSA. I don't currently work for the NSA. I'll pause the offense question for a minute, but yeah, we do group things into, there are certain decisions you make at architecture time. There's obviously, identity and detect wise, there's certain things we have at in terms of passive defense. And then not just because I'm on a meeting with Carl, but like active defense has been the big growth area for us over the past, I would say 18 months, whether that's active more on the kind of intelligence collection side or active more in like exposure identification. And hey, we're not going to wait on a passive vulnerability scanner. We're going to more actively go do some lightweight form of red teaming to test out like TTPs against our infrastructure or something. So that was kind of the missing thing in a lot of these cases for us.
Great. Fantastic. Hopefully that answers your question then. So as I was just saying, guys, if you do have additional questions, if we weren't able to get anything specific that you were hoping to, feel free to reach out to Carl, reach out to Clayton. You can obviously see these guys are passionate about passing it forward, and Clayton mentioned, he's happy to share some info outside of this particular session here. So please do that. Jake Kleinholz, was saying he needs this recording to show the leaders what he's been banging the drum about for 3 years. So it's certainly resonated with a few. Thank you all for your participation and your questions to Carl and Clayton. So again, a bit of a virtual round of applause for those two for taking the time and for sharing their expertise with us. We're now